Oh, good lord, why am I doing this again? Well, it's the second video of Final Fantasy VIII. This time we're covering disc 2. All being good, there'll be 4 videos, one for each disc. Now the first video did go through a pretty big chunk of the gameplay happenings, but there's still a fair bit more in that regard to go through as we go, along with some analysis of our characters as, hopefully, they stop acting like stupid people all of the damn time. But for now, we go back to the plot. We left our group in something of a sticky situation, seeing as our main guy had an icicle through his chest and all that. How's that going to resolve itself? Well, we don't know yet, because we're starting disc 2 with Laguna and the quiet life. He plays around with a kid named Elone, who's the daughter of someone named Rain who nursed him back to health following his big old fall. It's been 2 years since that happened. They're in a place called Windhill, a very quiet town that's almost empty in fact. Laguna's main job is defending it from thoroughly average monsters. The reason why the town is so barren is because most of the men are at war, which is a sign that these Laguna sequences aren't parallel, they're flashbacks. Around this time, well over 10 years back from the present, there was a big war between Galbadia, who Laguna and company belong to, and a place called Esfar, which we know little about. We were attacked by their soldiers in the last flashback. The nature of the world was changed by the wars, although considering their status now we can clearly infer that Galbadia won. Kiros comes to visit Laguna, and we get some more revelations. Ward's now a janitor in a prison. Oh, and the subject of Julia comes up, the girl who Laguna wooed at the hotel way back and spent a night with. Apparently she always spoke of her true love who went to war and never came back, Laguna obviously, and he knows it. But she ended up marrying someone named General Caraway, thus giving us a link between the past and the present. Julia, who we saw at the piano, is Rinoa's mother. How this resolves itself isn't necessarily known, but the breakup of this relationship seems to also be a part of the beef between Rinoa and her dad. We do a bit of patrolling and find that Laguna's dreams of travelling the world and being a journalist are fading. He actually wants to settle down. Everything is purposefully uneventful, and he likes that. Rain likes him a lot, but worries that those dreams will take him away. And finally, Laguna worries that one time he's going to wake up and all of this just won't be there. He'll be somewhere else. Which is an obvious cue for this flashback to end, easily one of the strongest written parts of the game so far. It works out great, beautifully done, and a much needed moment of calm after the events at the end of disc 1. Every character in this bit, from Laguna and Kiros to Rain, Elone, and even the residents of Windhill, none of whom care much for Laguna, are superbly fleshed out in an effortless way that you don't often get with JRPGs. Top marks. Of course, in FF8 you do have to take the rough with the smooth, and so it's followed by D District Prison, which is where our group is at. Actually, the character writing does continue to be good here, it's just the level itself that's so horrid, but we'll get to that. Surprisingly, when we come back we're with Zell, who's just waken up from the flashback, not Squall, who isn't here. We're all in jail, we don't have our weapons, we're probably going to be executed. Things kinda look rubbish. Zell gets thoroughly abused by a warden, and Rinoa gets taken away for God knows what. Finally, we do get to see Squall himself, who is all alone in a different part of the prison. Miraculously, his wounds completely healed. The storyline reason is presumably that Adir healed him so he could be interrogated about Seed, who Adir absolutely hates for some reason. But this is also the big jump-off point for one of the game's more popular fan theories. The one which states that Squall died when he took that spike to the chest, and the rest of the game is his fever dream in the moments before expiration. No point exploring that now, we'll come back to it when there's more evidence to look at. Still, death is important here. The start of disc 2 is a knowing echo to how disc 2 of FF7 started, with the big sense that something is missing. The Windhill flashback and starting out with Zell does make you wonder for a second if the game has actually just killed off Squall completely, until you finally run into him again. It's quite well done. Another intriguing setup with regards to the flashback is that obviously we know Squall was in it playing Laguna as normal, and Zell was too. But Zell didn't play Kiros, he played Ward, who is separate from the others and working in a prison. Kiros was played by Irvine, who we don't know the whereabouts of right now. In fact, it turns out that Ward worked in this prison right here, so Zell knows quite a lot about the prison's layout and how it works. How convenient. And then, while the group bemoan not having weapons, Zell suddenly remembers that actually he uses his fists to hit people all of this time, and so he fools the guard into coming in and knocks him out in one hit. Again, very convenient. He gets the group's weapons back and we're about ready to begin the prison break. First though, we beat the crap out of Biggs and Wedge again, who were demoted after their encounter with us back in Dole, and are now likely to be demoted once more. Poor guys. Before that though, there's some revelations with Squall and Cypher, who's doing a bit of good old-fashioned torture, asking Squall what the purpose of Seed is. But Squall doesn't actually know anything beyond Garden's role as a training school, and Seed are a mercenary group. He can't answer that. Not that Cypher cares. Cypher still thinks of himself as the knight in shining armour. Even if Romantic Dream says different, it's more of a mistranslation and he's Adir's protector, not her lover. He's still the classic good guy, only he's an asshole. I didn't mention this previously, but the two characters' costumes and colour coding make the role reversal very clear. Cypher's light coat is replete with Christian insignia, Squall has his dark jackets and X's. The Squall-Cypher rivalry is again where some of the game's strongest writing lies. Another point here is how personal things have become between them. If you were going to logically choose someone to interrogate about Seed first, well, you'd obviously choose Quistis. She's been a member of Seed longer than the others, was even an instructor at one point, and so surely knows more about Seed than all the others do. But Cypher chooses Squall because even though he's less likely to know the inner workings, he wants to hurt him. And because, in Cypher's eyes, he is the good guy and Squall is the villain. Anyway, the big news is that Adir wants Garden to be destroyed, so she's ordered missiles to be launched at both Balamb Garden and Trabia Garden. We haven't been to Trabia, but Selphie was transferred from there. And with that, the breakout begins. We go up and find Squall, who gets rescued by a bunch of Moombas, and then we go down only to find we're underground, and we go up again to bump into Rinoa and Irvine and yada yada yada. Minor plot things happen, but we'll get to them. I want to talk about how this is such an awful dungeon and what the hell happened to dungeons in this game. Seriously, 90% of the prison is the same floor, copy-pasted. It's like the Shinra HQ staircase in FF7, only mandatory and with random encounters. It's not the only time you get this either. It's the same with the sewers, with the Tomb of the Unknown Kin. Did all the people who made really good dungeons before leave after FF7? Because these are, for the most part, absolute shite. Even without encountering enemies, this dungeon is a pain not just because of its repetition, but how often you have to double back. And yes, there is a storyline reason, it is a prison, it's supposed to be disorienting like this, but still it's very poor indeed. Even the boss is literally just a couple of enemies you meet throughout this section. The writing is strong, but the gameplay, very weak indeed. To top it all off, you can literally game over right at the end if you take Squall the wrong way as the prison is moving. I didn't, but imagine not saving and having to do this again because you went left instead of right. Fuck this shitty, awful level. Couple of big plot things that I missed then. The Moombas who rescued Squall greet him with Laguna Laguna for some reason, another link between the past and present. Also, Irvine wasn't captured with the others. He evaded, had his flashback, and then was found by Rinoa, who was released from prison on the orders of General Caraway. Anyway, we're finally out of this shithole and in the middle of the desert. Fortunately we have some jeeps, but there is a crisis on our hands. Missiles are aimed at 2 gardens. Selphie in particular is very worried. And just as we're getting things organised, well, the first set of missiles launch, the ones aimed at Trabia. Balamb is next. We never had a shot at saving Trabia, and notably the group never fell into argument while the launch happened, but maybe Balamb can be saved. Squall, being the leader, breaks the party into 2, one led by himself to go to Balamb and warn them, and the other to go to the nearby missile base and stop or otherwise thwart the launch, to be led by Selphie, who as you might expect is in the mood to rip shit up. Getting in the missile base is easy enough, we've got some uniforms and an army vehicle, although ultimately I wasn't that stealthy. There are a couple of ways you can play this bit that involve not really getting seen, but being Selphie I thought it best to start blasting as soon as possible because that's just what she does. She hasn't had that much of the spotlight so far, but Selphie is like easily my favourite character in the game. She's hilariously childish, sometimes totally ill-suited to a situation, but still ends up actually getting shit done, and she is so cheerful as well. She gets all these funny little touches, like back in the prison when Irvine's having a big shootout with a seemingly endless amount of guards. She's sitting there cross-legged like she's at a bloody picnic. Or whenever she bashes at electronics and somehow manages to get shit done. Or all of her plans being something along the lines of blow everything up. She's great. And again, I want to stress how brilliant all of these animations are. That's one thing FF8 unquestionably has over FF7 in a big way. FF7 had good stuff too, but FF8, damn they did well here, especially on the PS1. Anyway, while we can't move the missiles away from Balamb, we can set their error ratio to the maximum, meaning they are likelier to miss. And we also achieve the end goal of setting this place to self-destruct, but we end up fighting this big old tank. We win, obviously, but the hunk of metal blocks the way out just as the missiles launch and the base starts to blow up. Things don't look good for Selphie's crew right now. Meanwhile, Squall's lot have reached Balamb, which oddly is already in a state of panic. Nothing to do with the incoming missiles, mind. The Garden faculty are staging a coup, and they want to find and kill Cid. This is all down to someone who we haven't met named Norg, the other boss of the Garden, the Money Man. And so we end up fighting a lot of the faculty's monsters while trying to find Cid. We also run into Fujin and Raijin again. They're still on Cypher's side, but apparently haven't found him yet, and they're tasked with trying to get people the hell out of here. In a somewhat outrageous double bluff, Cid have hid Cid right in his office, while pretending that they're hiding him somewhere else in Garden in order to confuse the faculty and buy themselves some time. According to Cid, there is one thing we can do. There's something mysterious down in the basement that even he doesn't know about that could, potentially, save the Garden. Going down there does feel like kind of a suicide mission, but what the hell, what else can we do? And so, yeah, it's another mediocre dungeon. This one based on an endless series of ladders. At least we don't have to fight so much, which is kind of odd, but yeah, we'll get to that in a bit. The dungeons by and large just aren't that great so far. Once again, we're confronted with a panel of electronics that we stab at randomly, and suddenly, the Garden goes flying. You see, Balamb Garden was built on top of a mobile shelter constructed by an ancient civilization known as the Centra. We explored one of their ruins back in the second Laguna flashback. And yeah, Centra. I'm not sure if this was a conscious callback to FF7's ancient civilization, the Cetra, or the Ancients, but there is no relation as far as I can tell. Anyway, we set off the controls, and all of a sudden this huge garden is moving. It's now a ship. And thanks to this, plus the efforts of Selphie's group, the missiles miss their mark and end up not harming anyone. Of course, the garden is now floating in the ocean and no one has the faintest clue about how you actually control the damn thing, but at least we're not dead. We'll just float aimlessly around the ocean until our supplies run out, and then we'll starve to death. It's all good. After all this, Squall tries to get a bit of rest, but is interrupted by Rinoa, who's new to the garden and kinda wants a tour. We do that, and once again in the library, well, we meet that girl. The one who we saw in the infirmary right in the beginning, and then saved in the training centre. Strange, she knows us, but we don't know her. And then we're called to meet with Norg himself in the basement. He's not happy, putting it mildly, and he's also kind of inhuman. There's a lot of exposition in the big Norg chat. He says that we were essentially played into taking on the mission to assassinate Adir by Martine at Galbadia Garden, for whom our appearance there was somewhat convenient. One of the more shocking reveals though, that kinda comes out of nowhere, is that Adir is Cid's wife. Huh? Well, that might go some way to explaining why Adir hates Cid so much, seeing as Cid is Cid's baby. Ultimately though, Norg plans to deal with Adir diplomatically by offering the heads of her would-be assassins on a plate. That being us, so we've got to fight him. Needless to say, this decision does not go well for Norg, and now he's thoroughly dead. This clears up the civil war in the garden at least. Norg is, or was, a member of a tribe called Lashumi, who we'll presumably run into again at some point. When we meet up with Cid again, the exposition continues. Cid knew full well who Adir was when he married her, but things went well at first and it's implied that she had a big hand in building Garden. And Norg, well, he was important in providing the money to get Garden built, but naturally all that money then had to be paid back, which is the reason why Cid basically became a mercenary group offering their services to the highest bidder. This is why the Garden faculty were so unhappy when we were all shipped off to serve Rinoa for a pittance, which ultimately led to the situation we had when we returned to Balamb. It's all tons of dialogue, although it does serve as something of a turning point. As it is, we encounter another ship. We suspect Galbadians at first, but that's not likely. These mysterious people come in peace and they're after someone. A person named Alone, who is at the garden. They want her because she is not safe there. Alona? Yep, the same little girl from the Laguna flashbacks. Who do you think she is now? It's pretty easy to figure it out. She's that mysterious girl who we keep bumping into. And yes, she is the reason why we keep having those flashbacks to Laguna. When Squall meets her again, she says that she wants to change the past. Considering all the things that have been laid on Squall already, he is kind of unhappy about his role in this. Everyone's looking to him as a leader more and more, and we know how uncomfortable he is with that. But apparently, he is Alone's only hope. As she goes with the other folks, that's all we know. And then, to top it all off, another attempt to just go and have a chilled walk and talk with Rinoa is thwarted by Cid calling Squall again and officially laying out the mission at hand. The garden is now a mobile base with the sole purpose of defeating Galbadia and the Sorceress, and Squall is the leader of that. Everyone in Garden is now under Squall's command, because Squall obviously loves being the leader so much. When it rains, it pours and all that. Before anything else though, our floating ship that we can't control finally crashes ashore at a place called Fisherman's Horizon. Miraculously, the hulking great fin doesn't kill anybody, although obviously we're going to have to go there and make our apologies. Right, well, we'll get into Fisherman's Horizon soon, but for now let's move on to some analysis. One big thing to point out is that all these scenes can play out very differently, dependent on how you split the parties. If you want the most dialogue and lore, then the best thing to do is take Rinoa and Quistis with you to Balamb, especially Rinoa as she's not exactly familiar with the place. But everything plays out very differently if you don't take her. There's a lot of branching paths in the game, which is good for multiple playthroughs. It's also worth noting how often you actually play as other people, as it's quite different from FF7 where, short of the odd battle and the parts where Tifa and Cid were in charge of the party, you were basically always Cloud. By this stage of the game, everyone has had a shot at leading the group, or they've flown solo, with the exception of Irvine, and he'll get one too. It works well, especially if you think of FF8 as more of an ensemble than just a story that's based on one or two people, although we'll see how that holds up. Now, a big theme throughout this disc so far has been not just the continuing transition of Squall from passive grunt to something of a leader, but the transformation of Cid itself and what its goals are. Throughout Disc 1 we were always under contract for all of our jobs and tasks. That didn't change until Disc 2, when the party splits into two and goes to the missile base and Balamb. That's the first time we've done something that's not under a contract. We did it because it's important to us, what we have to do. The game doesn't make a hubbub about it, but it's the first time that we've done something for an actual cause. The old ways of Cid then naturally change with the death of Norg, but yeah, things are, at least for now, a little more conventional. Good against evil and all that, even if we still actually don't know anything about Adia aside from her being Cid's wife. The changes in Squall are also carried off pretty well. While he's still not comfortable with being a leader, you notice the differences in conversations and how he talks to people, unless he's thinking about it too much. It's like he becomes more active without realising it, or discussions that would probably end up disintegrating into an argument do not. Going back to the split mission, one touch I like is that it would be obvious to have everybody bickering just as the missiles are launched towards Trabia. That'd happen in Disc 1 for sure. But it doesn't. They're trying to get organised, but they just never had the time to stop what happened there. It's a sign of the group's growing cohesiveness and maturity. We're about halfway through Disc 2 already, and the plot is still moving along fine. Story-wise, the game has actually recovered quite well from the unending stupidity that happened at the end of Disc 1. What hasn't recovered, mind, is the gameplay. That's gone considerably downhill. I already mentioned the dungeons. So far they are very lacklustre indeed. The best one we've had so far is still probably the first Cid exam, if that even counts. Traditional ones are just copy-pasted rubbish, and that's quite disappointing. As far as the game breaking goes, that's still sort of a thing, but it's so straightforward that by this stage, there's not much you really have to do. Soon everybody's got tons of HP and can do tons of damage, and you only need 3 setups like that, which you then just switch around your party depending on who you're controlling. And that's another big problem. Every character in FF8 largely starts out as a blank slate with only minor differences in stats, so you can build whatever party you want, but in the end they're all interchangeable so it doesn't matter all that much who you pick. Characters aren't important, just setups. The only other thing that really changes things then is the limits, all of which are indeed very different depending on the character you're using. Quistis has her enemy skills, Rinoa uses her dog, Selphie gets to cast spells at random, Irvine uses ammunition that you find in the world, Zell hits the enemy with the help of fighting game style combos. That's all different and good, but it's not really enough. And really, by this stage, you might not even be getting into fights anyway. Diablos, the GF that you find in a lamp that Sid gives you, has 2 thoroughly broken fins that you can learn. Ink half, and after that, Ink none. The first halves the random encounter rate, and the second takes it out completely. They're not difficult to learn, and Diablos is not a difficult fight if you've played the way I have. Once you've learned Ink none, well, that's it. As long as you have it on, the only enemies you will ever fight are bosses and other fixed encounters. And I find that, well, baffling. Why include it? It's almost an admission of how bad the dungeons are. Here, use this and you can just run through them as quickly as possible without the added ordeal of fighting. Or that the system in the game is just, in general, quite broken. You could say that, well, you won't gain levels anymore. But gaining levels is on the whole bad because enemies level up with you. There is literally no practical reason not to use this ability once you've learned it. The only reason that I will ever take it off is to at least get the flavour of places we go to by seeing the battle scenes, monsters and whatnot. But honestly, the battle side of gameplay by this point is just about over. The only thing that's really there from now is to see just how much more you can break the fin. And, you know, there is a limit to how much I want to spend playing cards and stuff like that. It's not all bad, mind. We do have the story, and all the character analysis and plot and all that. Let's just get into that. Fisherman's Horizon is quite a cool place, a man-built structure that functions as an island, populated entirely by peace-loving mechanics. The mechanics part is good. Of all the places we could have crashed into in the world, it is very convenient that we crash into the place filled with people who can probably fix our shit up and get us moving. Mind you, our reputation does precede us, and we are unpopular for more reasons than cosmetic damages. We are mercenaries, and our presence immediately brings fear to these peaceful folks that we're gonna screw shit up somehow and bring some assholes over. When the first thing out of the mayor's mouth is, "When are you folks gonna leave?" that's not really a sign that you're welcome. As it is, however, Galbadian soldiers do come to the horizon. Interestingly though, they're not after Seed. They're after Alone, the girl who's making us dream of Laguna. In fact, we're almost an afterthought. The Galbadians act like arseholes, say they're just gonna burn this place to the ground anyway, even though the fishermen obviously know nothing, and naturally we intervene and beat them off. The Galbadians also carry a beaten up piece of shit vessel known as the Ironclad with them, which, as it turns out, was also housing a disguised Selphie, Irvine and Quistis, meaning that the full band is back together. Hooray! Squall is legitimately thoroughly pleased to see that they made it back, something that Rinoa comments on. Not because she's surprised that Squall was concerned, but because it's Squall once again showing that despite what he thinks, he actually can take the lead. As it is, we're not done here. There's plenty to do in Fisherman's Horizon while we're waiting for the ship to be fixed, including one of the single arse-holiest moments in the game. Mayor Dobe tried to deal with the Galbadian soldiers the way he knew best, through discussion and reasoning, and it failed. Squall can take this opportunity to condescendingly explain to him about how what he does is very necessary and that we should be able to look past each other's differences and all that like he's Brad fucking Paisley. It's brilliantly prickish. The guy nearly had his whole town razed to the ground, but whatever, it's an important lesson that he must learn. When Squall beats the absolute piss out of a G soldier with a complete overkill Renzakuken, it means something. Ah, Squall, you are such an arsehole. Needless to say, Mayor Dobe doesn't have anything to say in response, although I don't think it's because he's thinking about it. I should stress that the way the scene plays out does make this reading feel like the correct one. It's another bit of fun writing exploring one of Squall's many faults, his complete failure to connect with people and not say things that may be logically correct, but are emotionally bullshit. Aside from that, Fisherman's Horizon is a big place with lots of little things to explore. It kinda sums up the game's commitment to local flavour and extra dialogue. Virtually every waypoint in the Fisherman's Horizon quest comes with an entirely new set of lines for the town's NPCs, and this isn't even a long quest. There's a whole storyline with the Fisherkin, who you see in the FMV when Garden crashes into town, that you'll easily miss if you don't go down a very hard to spot ladder right in the beginning. You can also find Martine here, the ex-headmaster of Galbadia Garden. He's actually been kicked out of there and is now contemplating early retirement at Horizon. And here's a big example. There's this bit where you're in control of Irvine only, while he judges what musical instrument members of our party should play. He's only useful in this one screen. And yet at this time, you can take Irvine around the town, and again, there'll be an entirely new set of lines dealing with Irvine walking around the place solo. It's crazy attention to detail, and you can easily miss tons of it, as I did. Final Fantasy VIII is maddeningly inconducive to video capture because of this. Anyway, yeah, musical instruments. The rest of the group are trying to do something nice while we're waiting for things to happen. Partly to try and cheer Squall up a little, partly to kinda work at getting Squall and Rinoa together, and also kinda for Selphie as well. Considering that her home garden is very likely in ruins, she's kinda down in the dumps. Irvine doesn't care much about that though and sees this as an opportunity to make a Mac move on her because he fancies her. I haven't mentioned it much, but this is as good a point as any to stress that I do not like Irvine, and he is easily my least favourite character in the entire game. Hell, I think I like General Caraway's puzzle-loving guard more than I like Irvine. Anyway, this is another little puzzle where you get a set of instruments that go together for a fast piece, and another that's best for a slow piece, and there's multiple outcomes for the scene depending on what you choose. The one that's good is very specific indeed. It's a mixture of the two, and it's really hard to get. I didn't manage it, and so the concert kinda goes a bit pear-shaped. Rinoa and Squall end up having another argument because Squall is still struggling to make that big connection. Something deep within is stopping it. We get little clues to it now. It's obviously something connected to childhood, and little flashbacks while Squall is sleeping point to a huge loss in his childhood, presumably of a sister. Elone wants to change the past completely in a literal way, while Squall is carrying the burden and struggling to make that mental change. And so, we're done with Fisherman's Horizon. Not only have the mechanics fixed the boat up, but they've shown us how to control it. We can move again. Woohoo! Now this is actually a big moment. It's the first time after a long stretch that we've really been able to relax or backtrack to old places we want to go to. Really, the storyline hasn't stopped moving forward since we first went to Timber. We've been on a one-way path ever since through Dealing City, the prison, all the flashbacks, back to Balamb Garden, and now to Horizon. That's a long frickin' time. Now that the garden can be moved, we can pretty much go anywhere. It can traverse the ocean, but it can also hover over ground as long as there's a nice low area like a beach that it can climb onto. It's like a considerably better Tiny Bronco. And so while it is suggested that we should go back to the town of Balamb and see what's happening there, we're obviously not going to do that straight away. There's some things we ought to do. It wouldn't be a Final Fantasy game without side quests after all. First thing I do is clear up that Tomb of the Unknown King quest, which kinda sums up the game's awful dungeons so far. It's a maze where every screen is virtually identical, and the maze part is entirely obviated because you can literally go right at every chance you get, solving the little puzzles along the way, and then once you find yourself back out of the tomb, go back in and go straight to the centre for the final room. The reward for this is another GF, Brothers, which is pretty much the last one I need to ensure that all three of my setups involve high HP, high strength, and hitting everything in the game like a frickin' dump truck. We'll still be getting more, mind you. Speaking of GFs, there is a couple of classic series ones we can get right now by going south to a place called the Central Ruins. It's a big old tower dungeon that's mostly based around a puzzle, and hey, it's not all copy-pasted. It looks quite nice in fact. Shame it's optional. Anyway, the Central Ruins are mainly home to Odin. As soon as you get there you have 20 minutes to find him and defeat him. The puzzle itself is simple enough, and to be honest there's lots of time to fight Odin. If you've never had a fight against him in any FF game then it pretty much goes like this. You have a set time to beat him, during which he will do nothing, but he has very high defense. If you don't beat him in the time, he absolutely murders you with Zantetsuken or Iron Cutting Sword. No matter what defences you have, this is instant death. Of course, it's kind of easy for us to beat him in that time, but Odin is one of the few monsters from which you can draw triple magic, which is one of the best junctions in the game. Naturally, we do that for a bit too before beating him. Odin works differently to other GFs. He doesn't learn any skills. Instead, once you have him, there's a chance that he'll interrupt a battle and just flat out kill your opponents with Zantetsuken. We won't see it much seeing as he doesn't do it against bosses, but it's still cool to have a Norse god on your side. Central Ruins is kinda the home to FF's passive monsters. The other GF you can win here is Tonberry. Ah, Tonberry. My favourite enemy in the whole Final Fantasy series. He's cute, he wears a hoodie, and his main attack is to slowly walk up to you, and once he gets up close, he fucking stabs you to death. Limmy would love this little guy.
Fucking come here and fucking stab you, you fucking bomb.
Tonberries also have another attack, a counter called Everyone's Grudge, which damages characters based on how many monsters they've killed in terms of having personally delivered the finishing blow. Used on Rinoa here, it's somewhat negligible. She's not delivered many final blows. When it's used on Squall, however, it's a one-hit knockout. I freaking love Tonberries. Anyway, this is kinda dull. You just fight a random amount of Tonberries, ideally one-shotting them with limit breaks before they can use the grudge. I should note that in one of these fights I managed to hit the 999 mark with a critical hit on Blasting Zone, the most powerful of Squall's finishers that I have. Unfortunately I wasn't recording at the time, which is a pisser. After about 20 or so Tonberries, you fight the Tonberry Kin. He's bigger and actually aggressive, although still not a difficult fight. Beat him and you get the Tonberry GF. It's quite a tedious quest and the GF isn't even all that good in the end, but I had to do it, just because it's Tonberry, to be honest with you. Onwards to more plot-related areas. At this stage you might want to pop over to Galbadia continent and pay a quick visit to Windhill, the place we saw in Laguna's last flashback. Maybe there'll be some clues there. The monsters aren't there anymore as it goes, but nor is Laguna, and nor is Wayne. The town seems a little friendlier towards outsiders than it was in Laguna's day, although it is still a case of being tolerated. Through a bit of asking around, we don't actually find out a lot about what happened to Laguna, but we do find out that Wayne is no longer with us, having passed away a few years ago. We don't know why though. Is that why we're having the dreams? I guess we'll find out more in a later flashback. Other than that, you can of course revisit all the other areas. You can go and see how Dole's doing, how Timber's doing, even head straight into Dealin City without a care. There's bits of new dialogue to be had all over, and if you're interested in that then it's certainly worth doing, along with various little side quests and what have you. If you want to continue with plot though, you've got to go to Balamb Town. As much as I could have you watch me screw around with bones, dogs and cards for another 15 minutes, we kinda should do that. One last thing to notice that if you go to where Galbadia Garden was, you'll find a hole in the ground there too. That was obviously built on a similar shelter to our one, and I guess that they figured out the secret. If you put 2 and 2 together, and add Martine being kicked out of there, then it's quite likely that Galbadia's garden is under the control of a deer by now. As we reach Balamb, you might well notice that Galbadia Garden is here too, thus bearing out what I just said. The town's under Galbadian control. Once again they're looking for a loan and threatening the town with violence, even though it is pretty clear that no one has the faintest idea of what's going on. We blag that we have info to get in and try to do the same to get to the commander, but we need to pay our respects to the captain first. It's another rather humdrum puzzle bit, with Zella's the obvious mandatory inclusion in the party. This is his hometown after all. On speaking with his ma, we get a clue to the commander's identity. She has grey hair and is wearing an eye patch, meaning it's Fujin, and presumably she and Waijin, obviously the captain, managed to find Cypher and get themselves a position. You find Waijin after finding out that he's cooked fish in the Dinks kitchen, then you give that scent to a dog who chases him out, and you end up fighting them and blah blah blah. The Fujin-Waijin fight can actually be tricky if you don't have your junctions set up properly, but it's not much of a big deal. The scene that plays out is kind of interesting. Fujin and Waijin aren't interested at all in what Adia's doing, and they're sticking with Cypher because they're basically his only friends. It's all about loyalty, which gives Squall some thought. Loyalty is the one big thing that he's never believed in. He doesn't think or even understand the concept of people just sticking with each other through thick and thin, although it's gradually starting to make more sense. One of those things that's not spelt out, much like Squall not really caring about what happens to Balamb really. In the end, we let them all go with the proviso that the next time we all meet, that probably won't happen. We're kind of at a loose end, but Selphie's recovered from her rest, and there's one place that she wants to go. We have to go north, to Trabia Garden, or whatever's left of it. Selphie has still been her usual cheerful self, although it's clearly taken a bit of effort right now. Now we've not really been north at all yet, and there's a bunch of stuff we can see here if we want, such as the Shumi village where Norg came from. We'll get there, but for now we're probably all curious as to what happened in the other garden. Even from the world map things don't look good, and on getting there it's plain to see that the garden was directly hit by those missiles. Trabia has what remains of a halo on it too, meaning that it's possible that if anyone knew about it, the garden could have flown away from danger. Selphie remains cheerful while exploring the garden's ruins. There's still a lot of people around trying to make the best of the situation, and Selphie's excited to see her friends. There's various little moments where Selphie is encouraging people to keep strong and cheerful, setting an example. And then there's the graveyard where Trabia's been burying the dead. Lots of Selphie's friends are here too, and she talks to them, which is, kind of upsetting. Eventually though, we all meet up in the basketball court. At first things progress as you would expect. Selphie wants to be with us when we fight the sorceress, because she wants her revenge. That's fine enough, and it certainly doesn't lead you to expect what comes next. This is the game's livestream moment. Tons of plot revelation is inbound, and it's going to come thick and fast, but I'll try to stick with it and break it down as much as I can. Rinoa is the first to speak out, and wonders why we actually have to fight, or rather if that's the only way. This is more to do with a difference she seems to feel from the rest of the group, that when they all fight, it's as if they're possessed by something, whereas she's more wondering if everything's going to be okay. This little bit is sort of like the camera zooming out. Because we always get Squalls in a monologue, we tend to think of him as the outsider in a way, because he concentrates on the little details that make him different from the others. This isn't true. Rinoa is and always has been the outsider, because she didn't have the upbringing of anyone else in the group. Everyone else grew up in Garden. Garden takes in and teaches children from a very young age. Garden is all most of them have known, except Rinoa, and although Rinoa has fought, she's experienced more than just fighting, or learning how to fight. Rinoa's question isn't one the group can answer. Fighting just comes naturally to us. For the group, there is nothing before or after Garden and Seed. Except for one of us. And funnily enough, it's the one who's kinda just been tagging along this whole time, seemingly only caring about guns and women, and generally being rather shit. None of the group remember anything from childhood other than Garden, but they weren't born there, and yet they've forgotten how they got there. All of them, except for Irvine. There's a reason why Irvine has in particular been very strongly after Selphie, and it's because of his memories. Irvine and Selphie, when they were very young, were in the same orphanage. Once the connection between Irvine and Selphie is established, memories start to jog. Quistis was there too, and Zell, and Squall. You might wonder about Zell being there seeing as we've seemingly met his ma, but the answer is of course that he was adopted. All of them are close to the same age, and they were all in the same place. They're all orphans. We do not know why they are orphans, or rather it's never spelt out, but all of our characters were born during a long and bloody war between Galbadia and Estvar. The answer probably lies therein. Wars leave a lot of orphans behind. We see scenes from the orphanage as the group remembers. There's another little tidbit. When we see the young Squall, he's talking about Sis again, and how much he misses her. Sis is not so much connected to the reason why Squall's at the orphanage to begin with. She was someone at the orphanage. Squall constantly shouts to the unseen matron, asking when Sis is going to come back, and so forth. Also, it turns out that Cypher was at the orphanage. And we see that in all this time, the characters and the relationships between them haven't changed a lot. Zell and Cypher, for example, have always absolutely hated each other. Cypher used to pick on him all the time. But if you asked them both, they probably wouldn't be able to tell you why they dislike each other so much. It's an example of their childhoods being rather stunted and broken. Whenever Squall and Cypher, or Cypher and Zell see each other, something just takes over from within. It's why Selphie's always naturally cheerful, or why Quistis is more indecisive and was so flirty with Squall in the beginning. She thought she was in love at one point, or that there was some deep connection between them. They can't put their finger on it, but it all comes from the orphanage. The big question, of course, is why exactly does Irvine, of all people, remember all this? Why does no one else remember? And why didn't he tell anyone? For Irvine, the difference between him and everyone else is clear. Guardian Forces. GFs are something we've only really discussed in gameplay terms up to this point, but as with most anything in FF, there is a big attempt to justify them in story. And indeed, it turns out that they play a pretty big role. Irvine, you see, hadn't ever used a GF until he met us. They didn't use them at Galbadia Garden. Selphie confesses that while they don't use them at Trabia, she did find one during a mission and used it for quite a while. But the Balamb students, well, they've been using them virtually non-stop. Balamb and Seed are indeed the only force in the world who use Guardian Forces. As we've seen from gameplay, Guardian Forces heavily augment a person's ability. For us, they've completely broken the game. If you took those Guardian Forces away, the now party wouldn't be much stronger than the average G soldier. They latch onto people's minds, essentially building a different, more capable person. It turns out, however, that they do have something of a negative effect on memories. While the question of dropping GFs does come up during this chat, we all know that's impossible. We are utterly dependent on them. But of course there is a morality issue here. Seed are meant to be more than just mercenaries. Guardian forces turn them into super soldiers, artificially, from a young age. This should be one of those big things to really clue you in that Sid Kramer, the headmaster at Balamb and a fervent advocate of GFs, is not exactly as nice or as bumbling a guy as he might initially appear. As for Irvine, well, it became awkward once he realised that we weren't clearly suppressing our memories of each other, that instead none of us actually remembered a damn thing. It's been building up to now. Up next on the revelation menu, the identity of Sis. We know she's someone who was at the orphanage, meaning she's roughly our age. She stopped being there, so perhaps a little older. And she is of course inextricably linked with our group, with Squall in particular. There's two people it can be really, and if it were Rinoa then I'd have probably turned the game off then and there. But of course, it's Alone. We don't know about Laguna, but we know that Rain has been dead for years. Perhaps that explains why Alone's been able to get into our heads in such a way. Also, not being particularly combat oriented, she isn't bound by GFs either. In the couple of times that Squall and Alone have met, Alone remembered him clearly. What isn't yet explained is why Adir wants her so badly. And so we come to the final revelation that all of this has been building up to. All these people went to an orphanage. They all went to Garden. Most of them to a garden built up by Sid Kramer with his wife Adir. And so, back in the orphanage, Adir Kramer was the matron. She is a mother figure to them all, something very important that they had all forgotten. She wasn't a bully or possessive or anything either, just a regular matron. Something clearly happened, although none of us know what that is. But it explains a few things. Going back to when we very first saw her, when she took control of Cypher, was that really mind control? Or was it simply Adir knowing exactly how she could control him, taking him straight back to his childhood? There's now a big family angle in Cypher's protection of Adir too, and his role as the knight. When we fought Adir, she spoke to us and dismissed us like we were naughty children, and when she basically killed Squall with an icicle to the chest, she revived him to the point where the wound never actually existed. A big part of that was undoubtedly motherly instinct. And so not only do we all have a big childhood link to each other that's naturally brought us together, but we have that link to our enemies, and undoubtedly it is because of our enemies that we are together now. It's important that we don't forget it. Now that the revelations are over, and we are fully aware of the reason why we have to fight, Rinoa feels even more like the odd one out, and yet she kind of isn't in a way. Much like FF7, all of this squad are now thoroughly broken in some way. They all had stunted, incomplete childhoods, half of which they can't even remember. Rinoa is perhaps now something to aspire to, a representation of a possible future, not just for Squall, but for the whole of the group, a way that they can be whole again. This isn't necessarily something that makes her better as a character, but it is a justification, a reason for her to keep coming along with us. And with that, the revelations are done. We will now travel to Adir's house, where perhaps we can find out more on just what happened to change the matron we knew, Adir Kramer, into Sorceress Adir. Next time anyway. After all those plot points, it is time to break it all down generally. This is the big point where the themes of Final Fantasy VIII assert themselves, surprisingly late on, virtually in the middle of the game in fact. Orphaned children, war babies, the lack of a proper childhood and how it affects people, makes them insular and untrusting, trying to make people into something they aren't, the effects that loss can have. Some of these themes are shared with FF7, although approached from a different angle. FF7 explored the short-term effects of loss, while FF8 deals more with the long-term and how people cope in a more abstract way, not necessarily just loss through death. There's subtle licks of it everywhere, even down to how people reacted in the short time that Cypher was thought to be dead, when Squall tried to reject the thought that in the end, people just become a distant memory. One thing that surprises people about FF8 is that, unlike a lot of FF games that are usually quite collaborative efforts, the scenario of FF8 was largely written by Kazushige Nojima alone. The somewhat fragmented nature of the game certainly makes that surprising at times. The plot can seem ridiculous. Squall suddenly finding himself in such a high position and leading the garden is often one of the big negatives that people point out, just for example. But there is often justification. Squall was the only real choice for that job, in all honesty. Who else could have done it? But we'll get to that. For now, while we're not quite at the end of Disc 2, it is perhaps a good idea to stop this video here and let all of these revelations sit. When we return, it'll be time for our leader to go to war. Bye for now. Thanks for watching this video. If you like this video then please do like it. You could also subscribe to the channel, check me on my Facebook or my Twitter, or indeed my Patreon if you'd like to see things like Google Hangouts or Skype chats or review requests and all that good shit. For this video I would like to thank the following: Adam Schaefer, Andrew Dalton, Andy Capt, Audie Soley, Chris Wilkins, Conformist, Dustin Cooper, Gary Pinkett, George Newton, Guatham Blackpool, Ian Roberts, James Idd, James Loveridge, Jason Goy, Jason Leach, Jason Stevens, Johan Eriksson, John Scott, Keith Barlow, Kyle F, L. O'Brien, Lee Norris, ManagerSim.net, Mark Heslop, Mark Johnston, Mark Whittington, Martin Pataki, Nanette McCrone, Olaf Albeen, Pete Morris, Filter Prog, Potter Margell, Rachel Maxwell, Romeo, Sean Zoltek, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Taylor Armand, The Unnatural, Tanyu Jay, Twisted Squote, and Vishar D.